guys, so I am here today to do my September reading wrap up where I review for you all the books I read in September, but to be perfectly honest, I have been in a bit of a slump. So I haven't really finished that many books. I mean, to be honest, I'm quite content if I finish one book in a month. Like, I don't have any grand expectations of myself, and I don't think there's a right or wrong amount to read. But compared to what I typically read, which is probably between 8 and 12 books a month, I haven't read anything close to that. I've read 3 or 4. So that's how many books we're going to be reviewing in today's video. In fact, let me confirm for you the number that we will be reviewing. I need to open up my Goodreads app to be reminded of what I have read. We will be reviewing 4 books. So without further ado, let's crack on. The first book I actually managed to finish in the month of September was Small Spaces by Katherine Arden. Now, this was actually a really great book for me to pick up because, like I said, I've been quite slumpy all month, and 2 of the other books I'm going to talk about in this video I'd actually started back in August. So I hadn't even read the entirety of them in September. I started them in August and was reading them into September. But whilst I was struggling to finish anything else, I decided to pick this up because it is middle grade, it's a children's book, and I thought it might be a nice, absorbing, easy, quick read to help me in my slumpiness, as it were. And it definitely was. It was definitely a great book to pick up when I was feeling that way, because I managed to actually read the whole book over the course of about a week from beginning to end. I didn't put it down and read something else. Apart from a little bit of the books I was already reading, I didn't leave it for a long time. I was absolutely absorbed in it, even if it was a slightly slower reading experience for a children's book than I have had some other times. I really enjoyed it. And it's actually a bit of middle grade horror, shall we call it. It's blurbed here on the front by R.L. Stine, who's the author of Goosebumps, which I feel perfectly encapsulates what you're going to get here. He described it as terrifying and fun. And when I was a kid, I remember genuinely finding Goosebumps quite terrifying. I think children's literature can be quite scary, not just Goosebumps. Some of the Roald Dahl children's books are somewhat terrifying, and I found really scary as a kid, but in a way that kids can actually really sort of handle in a kind of scary, creepy way that's quite fun as a child, and it's not going to leave you traumatized, if that makes sense. And this totally delivered. It didn't feel like it was dumbing down the fright factor for its child audience. It felt like it was delivering what is genuinely quite a creepy book to a child audience, and then even as an adult you might get a little jump scare here or there, and I certainly did. There was a really excellent creepy atmosphere to this book, even for me as an adult reader. Exactly kind of what I like, in fact. As somebody who doesn't necessarily love kind of Stephen King type horror, this had a nice bit of creep factor, and I think it would be a great one going into the Halloween season if you're looking for something to add to your October reading list. It's actually about this 11-year-old girl named Ollie, whose mum passed away the year before. Now, it definitely deals with grief, and I was actually really grateful that I was pre-warned of that in the comments of one of my other videos. Somebody let me know that it does deal with grief, and the grief of the loss of a parent, which is something I've gone through myself, and I like to know that going into book. I don't like to be taken by surprise by that kind of emotion, because it can just be kind of triggering, I guess, for me. But at the same time, I still felt like I wanted to pick this book up, and I felt like the way grief was handled in this book was just superb. There's something about, in my experience, ever since I lost my dad, that children's books manage to do sort of better than adult books manage to do. It's not that they necessarily do it better, but in a more palatable way for me as a reader. I find children's books can really handle grief in such an honest way, but it's also comforting in a way that's not always true of adult books. And for that reason, I felt more comfortable reading about death in children's books, and I thought the grief was handled really well in here, and it didn't overwhelm me as a reader who's experienced loss of a parent. I just thought it was really relatable. And I also loved the storyline. So it's about Ollie. Like I said, her mum has passed away. She's become a bit reclusive. She started sort of only hanging out by herself reading books rather than anybody else at school. She's not got a lot of friends, but she goes on a field trip with her whole class, only to get absorbed into this frightening other world and be put in danger. Obviously I don't want to give too much away because that would sort of be spoilers, but there's a creepy horror book involved that shares with some past and history with Ollie that she's able to piece together, and there's 2 other kids that end up helping her and being her companions throughout the story that are excellent as well. They're all individuals, they're all unique, and they make a great trio. And all in all, I just thought this was such a fun book, and it's actually the first in the series, so I'm definitely going to be picking up book 2. I know a lot of people love Catherine Arden's The Bear and the Nightingale series, and I'm definitely even more encouraged to pick it up ever since reading this, because I thought it was written really well. So I'm looking forward to reading some of her adult work as well and continuing on with this series. I also finished the Book of Phoenix by Nnedi Okorafor. This could almost verge on horror as well. It's definitely dark, gritty sci-fi. This one was actually the Patreon book club read for my Patreon, so every quarter my patrons and I choose a book together that we're going to read, and then I'll upload a whole discussion video about it so we can chat more about it, and that is something that I'm planning on doing in the next week and uploading to my Patreon. So if you really want to hear a big long discussion of that because you've read it recently, you can check that out. But my brief thoughts here are that I really enjoyed this. I'm a big fan of Nnedi Okorafor as it is. Like, I think she's just a superb writer, and I think her writing was superb in this. One of the things I was so impressed by in this book, and probably shouldn't have been surprised by, is how much she crams into what is actually quite a short book. So this is about 220 odd pages, and so much happens. Like, I could not give you a rundown of all of the events in this book in this video without it ending up like an hour long. It's mad how much she manages to pack in that short length of a book. But then again, the Binti series, which are all novellas by Nnedi Okorafor, also managed to pack a lot in even shorter books. So like I said, I shouldn't have been surprised. This is also sort of the prequel to Nnedi Okorafor's Who Fears Death series. So this is dubbed as book 0.5. It's a sort of origin story for the world that Who Fears Death is set in. And in that respect, that's super duper interesting. Quite a while ago, I read maybe a third of Who Fears Death, but wasn't right in the right head frame to carry on with it, even though I was enjoying it because it was quite dark. It dealt a lot with sexual violence and FGM, and you know, you just have to be in the right headspace to read certain things. So I'd put it down, but I had sort of been introduced to that world, so it was really interesting to get that background, and I certainly think you could read this before or after reading Who Fears Death and the rest of the books in that series. I'm not sure if it's a duology or a trilogy. But it also functions as a standalone because it is the story of Phoenix, who is a human that has been birthed and experimented on in a lab. So it's set in a futuristic version of our world where there are these massive labs throughout the country in the US that experiment on humans for various different reasons, and the majority of the people in these facilities that are experimented on are of African descent. They're black. So in that respect, there is definitely commentary on racism within the book, and also just sort of like the way we treat our fellow human beings, and sort of the future, and also kind of like corporations and money and capitalism and science and loads of dark, disturbing stuff. Like, it's a dark book. Like I said, it could verge on horror, some of the things that happen here, and it really took me aback in moments, but it was fascinating. It was such a detailed world. She really built this incredibly detailed world. The only thing I will say, and I love Nnedi Okorafor as a writer, but there was this like super weirdly sexist comment near the end of the book about the character of Phoenix made by a male character, and I don't know if that was just an attempt to sort of negatively characterize that male character, but if it was, that wasn't that clear. It just felt like a little bit weirdly sexist and threw me out of the story, but otherwise I love this book. I then listened to a non-fiction book on audio, which was The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which is subtitled Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colourblindness. And Michelle Alexander's argument in this book essentially is that the current sort of justice, incarceration, prison system in the US creates a similar environment to Jim Crow era law in the United States. She is exploring the way in which it divides the lives of white citizens and black citizens in the US in particular, and how it subjugates black citizens and excludes them from participating fully as citizens. And some of the information in this book I was aware of. I've read a few books on prisons now, and I've seen some documentaries on prisons, particularly in the US, because it's such a big issue there and there are so many prisons and it actually just has such a large population, and for that reason I did know some of the stuff in this book, but I also was so taken aback by some of the other information. Like, I was perfectly aware of the disturbing fact that in the US lots of prisoners in certain states lose their right to vote for the rest of their life after being incarcerated, regardless of the length of time they're in prison. I mean, regardless, nobody should ever lose their right to vote. That is like just absolutely inhumane. But that happens, and I knew that. I'd learned that in other books. But one thing I did not know was that incarceration in certain states of the US can lead to you then being ineligible for benefits, which honestly took me aback. I mean, the benefit system in the UK is not fantastic. It has certainly been consistently eroded by the Conservative government over recent years. You know, the welfare state is something that we're constantly fighting to maintain in the UK. But at the same time, it is still really shocking when you hear about things like that, which is something that doesn't occur in your own country and you just cannot really believe it. So as much as I know how many horrendous things go on with the US incarceration system and how much of a mess I know sort of the welfare state is in various different countries, that one really took me aback. And that's sort of a good example of the argument in this book, this idea that the majority of prisoners in the US are black, or the percentage of black prisoners compared to the population that is black in America, and the percentage of white prisoners compared to the population that is white in America is much, much unfairer in the direction of black citizens. So then these loss of rights as citizens are being applied mainly to black citizens of the US. So they're the ones losing the majority of their rights. They then can't vote, they can't fully participate, they can't necessarily find jobs as easily, and that's all on top of dealing with, you know, sort of racism in the everyday world. But the book looks at way more than that. The book is a massive study of tons of evidence all put together about the injustice and racism within policing and how that unfairly affects and treats black citizens of the US, and how they are more likely to be arrested despite committing the same crimes, even if a crime was committed. But if we're talking about people perhaps being picked up for drug crimes, the same number, if not more, of those same crimes are committed by white citizens, but they're not arrested as regularly. It's about racial profiling and all of that horrendous stuff. It's not something I can fully articulate here or give you all of the information about here, but that's just some of the stuff that it explores. And if you want to know that information, then I would highly recommend this book. Because as a book, it is very clear, it is very accessible. Like I said, I did know some stuff about the American prison system already, but I don't think my ability to understand this book was predicated on that. I think this book is very clear and concise and encompasses everything you need to know to understand that book itself. It doesn't assume tons of prior knowledge from the reader, which I think is really, really important with these kind of texts. So anybody can go into it and learn a lot from it about these injustices. And I think it's a really, really important conversation, and not just for people in the US. Like, I think it's important for people outside of the US to understand and be aware of as well. However, I will say I would love to read more books about the UK prison system because I haven't read any of those. Everything I've read has been about the US. So if you know of any or have read any, please leave your recommendations down in the comments, because I just haven't found as many that are quite as highly regarded as some of the ones I've read about the US. So that would be really fantastic, because I know the prison system is not great here either. I mean, it's not the same, but that doesn't mean it's good enough or functions well. So that would be really helpful. But all in all, just like a really, really impactful, incredible piece of non-fiction that I would highly, highly recommend. The last book I'm going to talk about in this video, though, I didn't even read in September. I read this book in January. However, I can finally talk about it, and it's The Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. So this is a book that I was sent a very early proof copy of. As you can maybe tell, apparently this was number 9 of 50. So this was a very, very, very early copy, and it was on embargo, so I couldn't talk about it immediately after I read it. So although I read in January, it was not in my January wrap-up because it was embargoed. But it comes out this month on the 8th of October, so only a few days now, and I can finally tell you what I thought of it. Finally, because when I read this book in January, I was so frustrated that nobody else I knew had read it, because all I wanted to do was talk about it. This is a book that is, love it or hate it, unforgettable, and you need to talk about with other human beings. So I'm really glad that more people are going to be reading it now, and thankfully between then and now some other friends of mine who review books have had early copies, and we've been able to talk about it with one another. So like, I've gotten some of that off my chest, thankfully. But you may recognise this author's name as the author of Convenience Store Women, a piece of Japanese literature that had a lot of praise, a lot of hype, and I loved myself. Like, I love Convenience Store Women. I think it's brilliant. This book is if Convenience Store Woman, similar like tone, definitely by the same writer, but as if that book was 100 times darker and maybe on steroids or something else, because this is so intense, so dark. I honestly don't think there's a topic that I wouldn't give a trigger warning for in this book. Like, this book has some things that I don't want to say because they happen right at the end and are spoilers, but really dark. But even just like at a base level, there is paedophilia, there is sexual like molestation and violence, there is sort of familial abuse, general physical violence, just like, I really mean it when I say everything dark that can happen happens in this book. This is like one of the darkest books I've ever read, but told in such an interesting way, because like with Convenience Store Women, it has this slightly detached tone, which I think is really interesting. Like, I really love this author's writing. I think this one's maybe a little bit too dark for me, like too much dark content, but that's not because I think it's a bad book. I think it's a really well written book, really interesting, explores that sort of topic of sort of what we expect from humans and social conditioning and social expectations and what it's like to be somebody who doesn't fit in to that box in the same way as Convenience Store Women does. So it's the same themes, but like I said, 1,000 times darker. I said 100, but I'm gonna go for 1,000. So like, if you like that kind of topic and those themes and the tone of Convenience Store Women and love super dark things, then you will love this. But be pre-warned, if you're expecting to read Convenience Store Women 2.0, it's not the same, and you will be a little bit shocked and taken aback because wow. And there's still so much I can't say in this review without giving spoilers away, but wow. The protagonist of this story is Natsuki. Now, Natsuki is a little bit different. She feels like a little bit apart from her peers and her family and never feels like she quite fits in. And she has this really strong bond with her stuffed animal, which is the little plushie that's on the front cover of the final copy. I'll insert that on the screen, who she believes is an alien from another planet, and that potentially she's an alien too, which is where the title comes from, Earthlings. So she either pretends she's a witch or a wizard or an alien, or truly believes these things potentially in order to sort of escape the world that she doesn't feel like she fits into. And then a lot of traumatic things start to happen. Like, it starts off quite light and cute, but as the book goes on, some dark traumatic things happen, and that sort of challenges even more Natsuki's relationship with those around her and how she fits into society, and changes the way she behaves, and her like trying to understand herself and why she doesn't fit in, and why people treat her like she doesn't fit in, and why people want her to behave a way that she doesn't naturally sort of lean towards, and sort of about that and her as a person, and her very close relationship with her cousin as well. I certainly appreciated the themes and the prose and everything about the author's writing in this one. I do wish I'd kind of known how dark it was going in, however, because I think not realising how dark it was going to be really took me aback as a reader. And I'd still say Convenience Store Women is like my 5-star read by that author, and the one I would automatically recommend, whereas this is for certain readers and not others. But those are all the books I read in September, and one that I read in January. So I hope you enjoyed my reviews, even if there weren't too many of them. I'd love to chat about these books with you in the comments down below, and then I'd also love to hear about any books that you found helped get you out of a reading slump, or genres that you find help you get out of reading slumps when that's how you're feeling about reading, because I could totally do with some of those. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone!